Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So today I'll be painting dreamy clouds or fluffy clouds. I primed the canvas in burnt sienna because I find that it provides a good undertone when I'm painting purple shades over it. I wanted to create a gradient because the moon is going to be on the left side, so I wanted to paint it light to dark from left to right. On the left side, the colors that I used are titanium white mixed with purple pale and just a dash of cobalt blue. And then for the middle, I use purple pale mixed with cobalt blue, and then for the dark side, I use Prussian blue mixed with cobalt blue and purple pale. When painting a blank background like this, it requires many layers to blend it from light to dark and for the paint to have this nice even finish. So to do that, I usually like to use a flat white brush because I find it so much easier to distribute the paint. Most of the time I like to let the layers dry overnight. Like this, it was done last night and then I leave it to dry and I'm working on it again this evening. By doing this, I realized that I'm able to see if the paint is even or if there's any parts that I need to touch up, and also it helps that it doesn't muddy the paint. I also find that adding too much paint over wet paint, when you try to blend it, sometimes the paintbrush will scrape off the paint below it, and then there'll be these empty patches where it's hard to get it to even out after you've applied so many layers of paint to it. But anyway, after 5 layers of paint, I am finally satisfied with the background. So the next step, what I want to do is to kind of create this shape of clouds around the canvas, or rather the placement of the clouds. For this step, I like to use a wool brush. Because of its fluffy nature by itself, I'm able to create these uneven shapes simply by twirling the paintbrush around. So for the clouds, I'm going from dark to light. So for the darker clouds on the left, I'm using mauve pale with Prussian blue. And then to the middle, I add mauve pale with rose red. And then towards the right, I'm using portrait tone and purple pale. It looks very rough right now, but that's okay because now we've got the placement of the clouds. So once I'm kind of satisfied with how balanced it is and everything, then I go back to work on the second layer, starting from the dark side. I'm using a smaller size blue brush this time and a generous coat of paint, and I'm just kind of doing these swirly motions to make the colors a little bit more opaque from the first layer. Trying to keep the edges of the clouds rounded and just a little bit uneven to achieve that fluffy cloud effect. Now the next step would be to add the highlights of the clouds, or rather where the light is shining through from above. So I want to add a little bit of portrait tone just around the edges, and this time I'm using a very frayed round tip brush. I actually enjoy this part because I can slowly kind of bring the clouds to life. And what I'm doing is I'm going in the same circular motions but just in smaller circles around the edges of the clouds. Over here I'm mixing cobalt blue with a little bit of purple pale and titanium white, and I'm going in between the clouds to create a little more shape and also for a bit of light to shine through from the middle of the clouds. So for the right side of the clouds, I like to call them cotton candy clouds. So I start with portrait tone, but I'm going to add a little bit of pink below the portrait tone, and I'm going to mix purple pale with a little bit of rose red at the bottom. Because this side of the cloud is lighter, I'm going to add more portrait tone, especially on the top part. I'm going to cover it all in portrait tone and slowly work my way down. This part requires a bit more patience because we're gonna, I feel that lighter colors are actually harder to kind of blend it. So we'll be working layer by layer with it. Once I've covered it all with portrait tone, I'm going to add pink with portrait tone on the second layer, just below the light part. And then at the bottom, I'm going to mix violet with purple pale and a dash of rose red. Throughout the whole process, I'm still keeping this whole swirly motion with the paintbrush. Now we're gonna go in for the third layer. I'm going to use a round tip brush for this. I think this is size 1. It's a bit frayed around the edges, but I like it that way because it's so much easier to blend when the brush is a little bit rough, especially for this kind of fluffy, uneven texture. So ideally you want to kind of soften the edges of the clouds where the light part is with the dark side. So what I want to do is I add a little bit of portrait tone, a little bit of purple pale, and also a little bit of Prussian blue, which is the darker shade of the cloud, and then I kind of just blend it and like with that circular motion. And some parts I make it a little bit lighter. By doing so, especially in the middle side, it kind of adds this glow to the clouds because there'll be like light shining through it. So you can see that the clouds are slowly starting to take shape, and the edges of it aren't that harsh because you're kind of just blending and softening it around the edges. So what I want to do as well, I'm going to add a little bit of highlights on the light part by adding titanium white just around the edges of the portrait tone, and I'm going to drag a little bit of the cloud out so it looks a little bit wispier. When painting in this style for the clouds, I find that you kind of have to make sure the colors go well together, because with so many things going on and little patches here and there, sometimes it can look messy if the color doesn't jive together. But and also it requires a lot of patience. You just have to keep going with that circular swirly motion until everything kind of blends in nicely together. I also want to add a little bit of portrait tone in the middle of the clouds to give it a little bit more glow. And this is a close-up shot of how it looks like up close with my very frayed and worn down paintbrush. But this brush, I love it, especially when it comes for blending these kind of stuff. So I'm working on the middle cloud right now, which is a little bit lighter. Then I'm going to just add portrait tone and more white highlights the portrait tone on the edge of the clouds. And then I continue to add a bit more purple pale and pink. So because the left side is dark and the right side is lighter, the transition has to be a little bit smooth. So in the middle of that part, I kind of start to prepare the transition by adding a bit of crimson and violet to the dark clouds. I find that the light part of the clouds are so much harder to do because there's just a lot more colors going on and trying to get them all to blend together and while creating the shapes of the clouds from dark to light. So at the bottom here, I add rose red and pink and violet to get, what's the color? Magenta. Yeah, magenta, or a little bit of pink, dark pink glow in the middle of the clouds. And then I continue to add more white highlights. This time I'm just kind of tapping it in around the edges. So I just take a bit of white and I dab. And then to soften it, I also take the portrait tone and I just dab around the edges of it. So continue with this step until all the other clouds are done. I like to add a little bit of like kind of like a smaller cloud within the cloud, or rather the shadow of the cloud at the bottom, and I darken it using violet and Prussian blue. By doing so, I find that it adds so much more depth to the cloud, especially when it comes to light and shadows, because right now the light is coming from the 10 o'clock direction, so I plan to make the bottom part of it a lot darker. This part required so much patience with just layers of blending and also trying to reshape the cloud so that it doesn't look too unnatural or awkward, adding darker shades and blending it with lighter shades so it has that fluffy, cloudy look. Well, it's really up to you if you want your clouds to be more peachy or more pink. So for me, I like to have that kind of pink glow in the middle, and rose red really does the trick. Now this is an up close shot again. This is of the clouds on the top right of the panel, the last batch of clouds. So you can see I'm just going in with a bit of purple pale and just twirling the brush round and round. So this part, because the clouds are kind of like the brightest, where the moon is shining from their 9 o'clock. So I add more white and more peach, and I leave out the dark shades from this part of the clouds. So over here, if not mistaken, I left the canvas to dry, and then I came to work on it with a fresh pair of eyes the next day because all the blending and everything, my wrist was dying and my back was hurting. But with a fresh pair of eyes, I'm going back in, and these are like the touch-ups. So I brighten where it needs to be brightened, and I darken where it needs to be darkened, and then I add more white, more portrait tone around the edges, and to make it more dramatic, I kind of accentuate the dark spots in between the clouds by adding more Prussian blue and violet. This part is pretty much the same as yesterday. It's just that I'm not satisfied with it, so I'm kind of just softening the edges, adding more colors so that it's a little bit more contrast from light to dark. I'm just going in to touch up any parts that needs be, and then I'm going to kind of fast forward this part so that we move on to the next step. Okay, fast forward the hours to the next step. I'm so glad we're past that anyway. It was a lot of blending and a lot of shading, but we're going to be adding more clouds. This time a lot softer and wispier clouds. Okay, so for this set of clouds, instead of doing that swirly motion, I'm going to take the paint and I just dip it into portrait tone, and then I'm going to smudge it. So I kind of make a few streaks and then I smudge it around the edges in kind of more left and right motion to get that very wispy floating by look, and then I soften it around the edges by blending it. So I wanted to leave the middle empty, but these clouds are just kind of like passing clouds that are continuation or just floating around the main batch of clouds. Once I figure out the placement of these clouds, I add a bit more portrait tone, and I also dip the brush in titanium white, and I kind of just blend it softly around these clouds. I find this part you need to blend it with a dry paintbrush so that you can get the edges of it to look kind of soft and wispy. So I'm just adding a little bit more here, and some of them I'm connecting it to the clouds below it so it doesn't look too odd just flying around. Once that is done, I draw a small moon in titanium white on this part of the sky. Next, I'm going to manually sprinkle the stars in the sky with the tip of the brush, a size 000 brush. So for the stars, I'm using titanium white, but I'm also going to add a little bit of stars in baby blue. So those will be the stars further up in the sky, and the white ones will be the one nearer to us. And what is a painting without flowers? So I'm going to finish this off with a pair of tulips. And just to make it complete the whole dreamy pastel look, I'm going to paint them in baby blue. And also because tulips are the easiest to draw, so I'm just kind of drawing out the shape of the tulips. I'm going to add a little bit of petals around it just to give it more dimension, and then now I'm drawing the stem in Monte's green and Prussian blue. So to get this shade of blue, which is personally my favorite shade of baby blue, I mix titanium white with Prussian blue and just a little bit of pink. This part is pretty easy. I just paint the whole petal in that baby blue, but on the insides of the petal I paint it in Prussian blue just to give it a bit more dimension. By drawing or painting, or rather coloring it this way, then you give this tulip a more 3D perspective compared to just painting the front petal or just the shape of the tulip. Because the lines are quite fine, so I'm using a size 000 brush, especially for all this kind of nook and crannies of the tulip. Once that is done, I take the brush and I use titanium white, and I kind of drag the paint from top to bottom, using like little fine strokes like this. Repeat this for the other tulip flower as well, and then I'm going to mix Prussian blue with titanium white, and I'm going to draw a line in the middle of the tulip petal, and then I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the white, but I start from bottom to top in Prussian blue and titanium white. I actually really like how these tulips turned out, so I might do one of these for my other sketchbook painting maybe in the next week. Repeat this step for the other tulip, and then we're finally on to the stem. The stem is the easiest part. I just paint it straight downwards, no leaves, no nothing, in Mighty's green and Prussian blue. And then after that, I just add a little bit of green meat on the top of the stem, and that is it. We are finished. I actually really like this piece. I haven't really been liking like the past few previous artworks ever since I came back from vacation, but this one I actually really like it. So it's available for sale on my Etsy. And thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you'll find this useful, and I'll see you again in the next video. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.
do do do